This discussion is being recorded by the Atlanta Forum Network and will be available online at www.atlantaforum.network.org. The objectives of the Society are to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, or ethnicity, to encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science, and to investigate unexplained laws of nature and powers latent in man. Let's take a moment and listen to this benediction. May the holy ones whose pupils we aspire to become show us the light we seek. Give us the strong aid of their compassion and their wisdom. There is a power that makes all things new. It dwells in the hearts of those who live in the eternal. There is a peace which passes all understanding. It lives and moves in those who know themselves as one. May that peace brood over us. May that power uplift us until we stand where the one initiator is invoked, till we see his star shine forth. Our guest speaker today is Mo Mitchell. And Mo is visiting from the Pensacola Theosophical Study Center. He's a newcomer to Theosophy, but plans to be a lifelong student. Mo will discuss ways we can find a deeper understanding of the vast ideas that make the essentials of Theosophy. He will help us to see that we must find our own way to answering one of the most difficult questions: what is Theosophy? It is different for everyone because Theosophy defines itself through each person's journey. Please give a warm welcome to Mo Mitchell.
Thank you, Jim.
You're welcome.
First, I'd like to extend my personal welcome to all of you and mention to you that when I was putting my remarks together, I specifically had your visitors and guests in mind. May you have many of them in the future. I will be speaking to you about the fundamentals of Theosophy as I have experienced them in my short time as a person on a conscious journey towards wholeness. I've been in the Society for about 11 years and perhaps started a bit before that. From my perspective, we are all journeying on this trip in life towards wholeness. We are brothers and sisters. Why go into the fundamentals of Theosophy? To me, the answer is to find information and ideas about the fundamental questions that we face in life. What am I? What's the purpose in life? Where am I going? What do I need to do now? Theosophical fundamentals won't answer all those questions, but they will help us develop an understanding of the nature of the questions and the nature of the answers. The really exciting thing about this is the possibility that we can take charge of our lives, the direction of our lives, and make progress in moving towards spiritual self-transformation. We're entering the conscious period of human evolution. My experience affirms the reality of that view. Why do I have the word some in my title? Should have had that up before. Well, we Theosophists are independent sorts, so if you ask Theosophist A about the fundamentals of Theosophy, you'll get one answer, and you ask another one, and you'll get perhaps a somewhat different answer with probably an area of agreement as well. But really, when you come down to it, the word Theosophy at its roots means divine knowledge, and we don't have it all. nor does any other group or organization or individual that I know of have it all. We are all seekers. The Theosophical Society is about working together to discover and be guided by truth. My plan for today is I want to hear from all of you. Now, if we had some visitors in the room, they might reasonably ask, well, how could they comment on theosophical fundamentals? And my answer would be that you can just as well ask yourself the question, what are some of the essential truths of life? Same question. My next stop is going to be to set some ground rules and then get into what I call the unlimited domain of truth. That's the context within which theosophical fundamentals reside. So, ground rules. There's a fairly small group of us here today, so there should be plenty of time for everyone's comments. But I would ask you to limit your comments to the extent that there's always time for someone else to speak. We will touch on some topics that are certainly deserving of their own full meeting, if not a series of meetings. So some of the things perhaps we won't go into as deeply as you might like, but as I say, it'll be a subject for another time. And the last ground rule, which I hope we can all adhere to, is to listen. Really listen to one another. And I have to tell you, that's hardest for the speaker who is busy trying to remember what he was going to say next while somebody else is talking. I'll try not to do that. Next slide. So my first subject here is the unlimited domain of truth. And I mean this in several ways. First off, truth is everywhere we look. Often it's best described as natural law. Now, one of our founders, H.P. Blavatsky, said that there is no magic. Miracles only seem like miracles to us. All is founded on natural law. So we're not talking about something outside the realm of the reality in which we live. We're talking about things that are part of the reality in which we live. Aspects of this natural law seem miraculous to us, like the growth of a beautiful child from the simple merging of two human cells. The development of human sight. Not only is our eyeball incredibly complex and beautifully designed for picking up the photons of light that carry the images of an object, but we're able to transmit that across our nervous system into our brain and recreate an image of what's out there. I can't tell you how that works. Now, our scientists know a fair amount of how it works, but it is just miraculous to me. And finally, consider the evolution of the entire universe coming from an outpouring of pure energy. If a fraction of the mass of a tiny little clump of U-238 can create an atomic explosion, think of the amount of energy wrapped up in this incredibly, fantastically large universe. Some, I don't know, 17 billion light years across the universe, filled with solar systems, planets, an incredible amount of mass coming from an unimaginable amount of energy. It's a miracle. My plan for today. I think I got a start on that, do I? Nope, that's a summary slide. Back up. I'm sorry.
Back up.
Yeah. Oh, you can leave that up. It's all right. I want to hear from you, the membership, on what you see as theosophical fundamentals. And at the very end of my remarks on the same subject, I want to take a moment to dwell on what the Theosophical Society offers to people pursuing a path into the spiritual side of life. Okay, so now what do we have on this? It looks like I skipped something. I skipped a couple of things. We're going to be looking at moral and spiritual truth especially. And I'm going to be looking at things about spiritual truth here, talking about it being timeless and paradoxical. That's what happened. I got ahead of myself. Did I say that natural law is not the private domain of any discipline, any group, any period in history? It is not. Now, when we talk about a period in history and we think about the technological progress of the human race, it's very clear that that's been on an ascending curve. We have become more and more technologically complex and technologically savvy as time has gone on, and there's been an explosion in the last half century, going through the miracles of modern medicine, microbiology, space travel, and the ongoing computer communications revolution that is connecting people all over this globe. So that certainly belongs to our current age. But in moral and spiritual development, there have been great seers and great teachers going back into antiquity. So that is timeless. This knowledge has been with us for a long, long time. When I use the term spiritual, I'm speaking about aspects beyond the material, the temporal, and the impermanent. It's the something more that we sense in life and in our very being. And perhaps both views contain truth. If you think about the Vedas, the spiritual writings of India, they go back for at least 4,000 years. And if one becomes a student of the Vedas or just listens to those who are, we discover that there are spiritual truths contained in that ancient literature. So they've been with humanity for a long, long time. Spiritual truths are paradoxical. Take, for example, the statement that we are all individual and unique, and that's true, and we are all one. And I hope to establish the truth of that assertion. Now, those sound like opposites. Unity, diversity. All one, individual and unique. That's a paradox. And if it's true, it defies explanation. All we can do is what I call live in the question. And to live in the question is to keep an open mind so that you're open to deeper and deeper understanding of this essential spiritual paradox. We can learn from both sides of it. Now I say that knowledge of natural law is not the private domain of any discipline, group, or any period in history. I've already covered that. In explaining spiritual paradox, I spoke of the spiritual unity of all life. On the spiritual level, we are all one. My first piece of evidence for this is that in the stories of awakening experience of people throughout the ages, not that I've seen that many of them, but I've seen a number of them in which the individual speaks of their personal boundaries vanishing. They have a sense of being part of all that is, an inseparable part of all that is. I even have a friend who is a student of meditation, and he has had a few instances of that feeling in his meditation sessions. If we look on the physical level, the common origins and the interdependent nature of life become apparent. Okay. And now I turn to the evolutionary nature of life. We will find further support for the unity of life in this discussion of the evolutionary nature of life. Now, evolution on the scientific level is well established. The fossil records contain records of the evolution of life on this planet, and in more detail, just incredibly more detail, our genetic structure contains that record. Our personal genetic structure contains that record. We have in our human DNA sequences of instructions for the construction of every cell in our bodies and much, much more. Matt Ridley, writing in the book Genome, talks about not only all these instructions for creating the cells in our bodies, but we have sequences of instructions in our DNA for creating cells that we don't have. In other words, there are instructions there for the creation of other types of creatures. He goes on to write the following. Know that all life is one. Seaweed is your distant relative. And anthrax is your close relative. That seems unreal, but the specific data to support that conclusion is right there in our DNA. Ridley goes on to say the unity of life is an empirical fact. He doesn't waffle at all. Everything is intertwined together. Everything not only relies on everything else, but everything is related to everything. Now, the Buddhists are better at this. They are wonderfully succinct. They call all of that interdependent co-arising. And they didn't have the benefit of all that science. The unity of all life and the evolutionary nature of life are themselves intertwined. Highly evolved individuals have experienced advanced states of consciousness in which life is experienced in entirely different ways. Mystics of different cultures, different traditions, and different points in time report very similar experiences, and they come to similar conclusions. The following are a few phrases. One speaks of the experience with the union of the wholeness of existence. Another one concludes that there are no others. You speak of self and others, and this person says there are no others. And another one had the experience of absolute being. And that experience of absolute being is an experience of the unity of all life as well. For absolute being is not separable. Next slide, please. I just realized that I made a mistake at the beginning. I should have asked you for your ideas about theosophical fundamentals. So I'm going to stop right here because I know you're going to talk about the next one. Oops, I already gave away the subject. Okay, Theosophists, tell me what you think the fundamentals of Theosophy are.
That we don't die, continue on. Reincarnation.
I think we could add Maya. This world of illusion?
The law of adjustment or readjustment or karma.
Principles of hierarchy.
You're going to have to help me with that one.
Right there, unity of all life.
Okay. See, I was supposed to do this first.
Law of cycles.
What kind of transformation?
Paths.
Oh, path to transformation. Okay. That's enough. Good ones. Okay. Unity of all life, unity of all life. The ongoing continuity of life. That takes in reincarnation, and we don't die, we continue on. Okay. I'd be surprised if you got everything I got, because I purposely looked for different ways to phrase some of these things for our visitors. Well, now let me continue. So I've come to the ongoing continuity of life. Okay, this is where I am. I claim that this is a difficult issue to deal with. When you get right down to it, we all possess a survival instinct. It was essential to our evolution and probably continues to be. It's built right into our genetic structure. That survival instinct gets wrapped up with our personal ego. What is the personal ego? Well, I'm going to assert that our personal ego, that idea of me, is just a collection of mental formations. It's part of Maya, part of this world of illusion. In fact, I think the existence of the idea of the separated self is the fundamental problem that we deal with as human beings. It's that personal ego. Okay. So we come to the ongoing continuity of life. We have this sense that life goes on and we're a part of it. And the ego says, hot diggity dog, I like that because I don't want to die. And we have a fear of death in our personal makeup. So if you think that we've lived before, that's cool, and we may reasonably expect to live again, the ego just loves it. And here we are, beginning to understand, beginning to work with this process of getting control of our ego and finally letting it go. And that's the problem with this business of reincarnation. Well, let's look at it and see if there's any reality to it. You can read the carefully selected and documented cases of persons with memories of past lives, written by Professor Ian Stevenson of the University of North Carolina. The man has done incredible research. Early on, the man is a psychology professor, and early on in his career he began to look into reincarnation, and he very quickly discovered that he needed to limit his research to cases of children with memory of past lives because it was so much easier, especially with third world children, who don't get around much, to determine whether or not their memories were something they had some possibility of having acquired in this life. And with these third world children, it was fairly easy to determine whether that possibility had any chance of being true. So, all these examples appear in his literature. The man is famous around the world for his research. And his research stands the test of being done in an unbiased way. My favorite example from his work is a case of what's called xenoglossy, Xenoglossy, which is the situation of an individual having a language ability that's unexplainable. And this one goes as follows. This young couple had twins, and these people were university people. So when their twins at about age 1.5 began making funny noises in their crib, but noises that sounded like communication, they were blown away. What could this be? So they took the kids to the language department where they taught, And they asked the language professors to listen, and so they put the kids in their crib in an empty office, and they opened the door to an adjoining office so they could hear, and then they got out of sight of the children, and after a few minutes the children began making these strange noises. All the language professors agreed that it sounded like communication, but they didn't know what it was. And about that time, a professor of Middle Eastern languages, older Middle Eastern languages, came by, and he knocked on the door. And he said, "Excuse me, I hope I'm not interrupting something, but I swear I hear Aramaic being spoken." And these 1.5-year-old twins were speaking Aramaic. An interviewer at one of Dr. Stevenson's presentation asked him if he believed in reincarnation. And Stevenson replied, "It does not matter what I believe in. What matters is what does the data tell us?" And the person says, "Well, does this prove reincarnation?" And he said, "Absolutely not. Even the fantastic cases, absolutely not. It does not prove it. However, if you want to believe in reincarnation, the data will support you." And then Stevenson went on to say there are other possibilities, but they are far, far crazier than the idea of reincarnation. So he didn't say the words, but what he was really saying was that's the best explanation we can come up with for the data that he had. So there's probably something like that going on. But as I said before, fascination with reincarnation can be an ego trap. It can cause a holding on to the ego-based sense of self that the Buddha said in his second noble truth is the source of dukkha, or psychological suffering. There's another way of looking at this whole area, and this is not to knock the idea of reincarnation one bit, but it has to do with the focus we take. Serious theosophists the world over, and when I use that term, serious theosophist, I'm talking about serious seekers after truth, whether they have anything to do with the society or not. These people have come to a way of looking at this. They look at it with the sure sense that life goes on and that we are some way an inseparable part of that process, and they let it go right there. They are focused on living this life without concern for past lives or a worry over a future life. They are focused on living this life. This life is precious. It offers us an opportunity to learn and to grow, and the most is to be made of it. So that focus on living this life, in my mind, is absolutely appropriate. I left with the feeling that my time investigating this topic was well spent. Come in. We're talking about theosophical fundamentals, and we're happy to have you join us. Would you like to have a seat? I felt my time was well spent. I left with an acceptance of life's processes, balanced with an appreciation for the very, very precious nature of life. Life is not to be wasted. Now the question is, will this equanimity hold up as I face my ongoing physical decline and death? Time will tell. Next slide, please. Our inner reality and our personal self. Have we got this up here? Was this what was meant by the principles of hierarchy, or was that something else? Whose was that? Am I on a different subject?
The principles of hierarchy?
No, I'm talking about our inner reality and our outer self. In other words, the human constitution. Is that a different subject?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll come to that then. Well, maybe I have one that you all didn't have on your list. Let's go with it. Theosophy offers a view of the human constitution that is personal on the material level and both individual and universal on the spiritual level. And this idea is carried forward in many places. If we go into the question of our true inner being from the Hindu standpoint, we find that the Hindu view is that our essential inner being is divine. In Christianity, it is seen that we have an immortal soul united with the Holy Spirit. In Sufism, which is the mystical branch of Islam, we are seen as ultimately divine. In fact, the Sufis work for a complete union with their perception of God right here in this life. And there have been those in the history of Sufism who have reached that state and been beheaded because the run-of-the-mill Muslim thought it was blasphemy for them to claim that they achieved a complete union with God, and in effect said, I am God. Now, Buddhists come at this question from a totally different standpoint. Exoteric, and I have to be careful with my words, exoteric, that which is right out in front of us, exoteric Buddhism is essentially psychological in nature. It has to do with learning to control and use the human mind successfully. But even Buddhists will admit to a belief in the inherent Buddha nature of every living thing. So there's that idea of the something more, the something eternal in Buddhism as well. Even in secular moments, we have a fundamental sense of being beneath everything else. And that fundamental sense of being is not the ego concern for life that I was speaking of before, but just this deep knowing that we are. And there is no time condition on it. Paradoxically, on the personal level, we are finite human beings, and we see the evidence every day in the mirror of the finite nature of our bodies. We are constantly changing. Our emotions and our thoughts are constantly changing. And even our set of memories is constantly changing because we're forgetting things and adding new things all the time. So I go back to the question, what am I? What is the nature and purpose of life? And when a person comes to that point that they're seriously asking those kinds of questions, the person is ready to become consciously engaged in his or her evolutionary journey. And at this point, it is no longer so much a physical evolution that was like we've been through, but it is essentially an evolution of consciousness. Okay, George? My next one I know is not on anybody's list because of the strange way I chose to title it. Can you see the bottom of the chart? The primacy of consciousness. Have you ever heard that in a theosophical book? Oh, you have? Good. Well, there's nothing new under the sun. I had a personal experience that led me to this, but let me back up first and talk about it at the physical level. Quantum physicists have discovered that the consciousness of an observer can be a determining fact in the behavior of subatomic particles. Now, if that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what will. In fact, some physicists go so far as to say that consciousness is the fundamental substratum of the universe. If you want to go into this further, I recommend Amit Goswami's book, The Visionary Window. You probably have all seen Amit. He was in the movie What the Bleep. How many of you saw What the Bleep? Well, you saw him. He's the guy in the pot hat. On the other side of the coin, spiritual masters confirm the experiences reached in deep levels of meditation when the mind becomes still. Jiddu Krishnamurti, a great spiritual teacher of the 20th century, speaks of this state as the silence of the meditative mind. And I'm going to try a quote. This is Krishnamurti speaking now. Silence has many qualities. The silence of the mind is not touched by any noise, by any word, or by the passing winds of experience. It is this silence that is so innocent and so endless. When there is this silence, action springs from it, and this action does not cause confusion or misery. The meditative mind flows in this silence, and love is the way of this mind. In this silence, there is bliss and laughter. You really have to sit and think about that one. And if you want to look it up, it's in the second Krishnamurti Reader on pages 30 and 31. Our little study center in Pensacola spent the better part of a year going through the second Krishnamurti Reader, and it was a wonderful study. He spoke of love. Love is the way of this mind. Spiritual love is revealed as we develop a meditative mind. Apparently, it is part of our very nature. Perhaps you've run into people who seem to understand what is actually happening in a situation and know just what to do. They respond in such a natural and unassuming way that others often don't even notice. And the others say, well, look what we solved. Taoists call that kind of action non-doing. The individuals that can perform non-doing have a state of consciousness that is that of a meditative mind. Next slide. The last topic I wish to, it's down at the bottom, that I wish to get into is this free will, choice, and consequences. And where'd karma go? Somebody said karma. Oh, the law of karma. Okay, myopic vision. When you hear choice and consequences, you know I'm talking about karma. But I tacked on free will because without free will, there wouldn't be any choice. We take pride in being a free people with the opportunity to make our life into whatever we choose. Of course, there are challenges, but we have this view that with hard work and maybe a little bit of luck, we can get there. An essential tenet of theosophy is that we are caught up in an evolutionary journey that becomes conscious and subject to individual involvement and direction. We have the power to choose our path, our focus, and our behavior. And we get to live with the consequences. And that's a two-edged sword, isn't it? But life experience shows us the truth of that statement. And to me, this is tremendously empowering. We have the power to create our own future. We can create suffering for ourselves and others, or we can create happiness, peace, and freedom. And it seems like a slam dunk, but we very often make bad choices. As we develop the attributes of happiness, peace, and freedom, we find that we are dealing with things of lasting value. They form a foundation for our state of being. Lasting happiness is not like the experience of a good time, a good meal, or even a major life event like the day of my wedding. In those cases, the joy in the experience rises, flourishes for a while, and fades away. Lasting happiness is not like that. It's like the happy nature of a happy child who finds joy in the experiences of the day. Just think now of a little child with this fascination with a bug, or finding its image in a mirror for the first time, or splashing in mud puddles. The key is that this child started off in a happy state of mind, and that formed a foundation for the experiences that followed. I think spiritual happiness is like that. It's a state of consciousness that underlies what we do, and it blossoms forth in what we end up doing. It's a substratum that lies underneath our actions. One of the more difficult things we face on a spiritual path is achieving what is called detachment. Now, some people misunderstand when you speak to them about detachment because they think detachment is equivalent to indifference or withdrawal, and it absolutely is not that. The detached person does not seem to experience judgmental or uncontrolled reactions to what's going on. They don't lose their temper. They don't experience the emotions of anger, aversion, or craving. That person just sees clearly what is happening, what is needed, and the way to respond that fits the situation. And what am I coming to again? Non-doing. But this time I want to make the point that a person that can operate in that mode remains at peace. And when I speak of happiness, peace, and freedom, that's the kind of peace I'm talking about. And we heard the quote at the beginning of our meeting. There is a peace that passes all understanding. It dwells in the hearts of those who live in the eternal. Finally, there is true freedom, the freedom from unskillful behaviors that cause suffering for self and others. It's the freedom from conclusions that prevent us from seeing clearly. It's the freedom to act accordingly. And it's also the freedom to experience the joy of helping others when we are motivated by spiritual love. And I emphasize that because I'm currently trying to help an individual with Parkinson's, and I was really struggling and wishing I hadn't gotten wrapped up in it and not being able to see how I was going to get out of it, and I just wasn't giving. And I realized that I was on the wrong track. Now, helping that person was not the wrong track. That was exactly the right thing to do. But I was not doing it out of love. I was doing it out of a sense of this is what I'm supposed to be doing if I claim to be a theosophist. And it wasn't working. So I took a good, long, hard look at the person until I felt real compassion and caring. And it's no longer hard. So we have to be motivated by spiritual love, the love that sees no boundaries, and the love that cares for all creation, not just other people. True freedom, finally, includes the freedom to become all we're capable of becoming. Okay, now I have a little summary chart. Slide it down a little bit, please. This free will, choice, and consequences is part of our evolutionary journey. It leads us to happiness, peace, and freedom, including detachment and the freedom from certain things and the freedom in order to be able to do certain things. So that's my little summary for that part. And now I want to talk about a way of life. Oh, I'm doing okay on my time. The process of discovery and harmonizing with the fundamentals of theosophy or the essential truths in life, whatever you want to call them. This process of discovery and harmonizing is the ongoing work of life. We now turn to the challenge of incorporating these fundamentals into a way of life leading to the happiness, peace, and freedom of an awakened consciousness. It is a way of life in which one seeks the realization of the unity of all life, in which one engages in daily study, meditation, and service, in which one practices the meditation of awareness as well as the meditation of silence. This meditation of awareness is something we do in our daily life, trying to bring ourselves to mindfulness so that we have awareness of self, of mind, and of surroundings. these practices, both kinds of meditation, lead us to peace, insight, and inner understanding. When one of my spiritual teachers happened to mention to me, well, you really ought to practice meditation, Mitchell. Meditation leads to the development of spiritual intuition. And I said, wow, boy, if that's true, I need that. And so I've been working with meditation ever since, and I do get occasional insights. So the last thing is serves. Service completes the triad, a path to spiritual self-knowledge that is transformative. A famous Blavatsky quote, "Should thou abstain from action, not so thy soul shall win her freedom." To reach nirvana, one must reach self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is, of loving deeds, the child. Now, after all of this, I have to tell you folks that the principles of theosophy are important, but they are secondary. They are useful in opening one's mind to the possibilities of human experience, but they are only statements that point towards aspects of the reality in which we live, aspects which must be experienced for true learning to take place. So it's good to know, but if we don't get out and practice, we won't learn until we experience these truths and make that experience part of our very being. So in conclusion, I would say theosophy is about awakening to the reality of unity, transcending the limitations of the personal self, becoming compassion and loving kindness, and serving humanity. Awakening, transcending, becoming, and serving, these are action verbs. Theosophy is to be lived. It's to be lived in the happiness, peace, and freedom that is our birthright, our destiny as human beings. Thank you. I've already explained that he can come to I get to ask a question then. Well, what's this about?
All right, I can help you to answer that.
She's in there. She's the one who
Was
posed it.
it pose that? Yes. We have beings, graded beings that run this world, this universe, and you start from the ones that are closest to the human beings, and you ascend higher, and you go from the
Guardian angels to
the angels, say the ones that run the earth, the one that run the planets, the one that run the sun, and so on.
The planetary Chohans, the human Chohan,
The intergovernment of the world.
They call Dhyani
Chohans.
Chohans.
Yeah.
Dhyani Chohans.
I'm familiar with that.
They are the hierarchies.
What does that mean to us today?
What does that mean to us today? That gives us an idea that perhaps the world is not run by a single God, but is run by a corporation.
corporation of beings.
Corporation.
Okay, you know what I said about paradox.
Yes.
So I can say something that sounds a little different without you thinking that I'm taking a different, that I'm denying this in any way, because I am not. If we get to the point of spiritual awakening in which we realize unity, Are they separate, or are we all part of the same thing?
We're all
Don't
part of
answer.
the same thing, but we are individuals.
I love it. Thank you. George, do you all have in your library the book Infinity in your hand?
I don't know. Do we, Gloria?
Who's it, Don? The author?
Who's the author?
I'll have to think about
Is it
that.
a theosophical book?
No, it's a
Oh,
book
well,
by a Unitarian minister.
Oh, that would be in this section. I don't know this section as well as, I know every book that's in there, but I'm not quite
I
as
don't
familiar.
believe we have.
Well, this is a wonderful theosophical book by a person who is not a theosophist and does not speak in our language. And at the beginning of his book, he gives us his worldview so we know where he's coming from. He is an educated Unitarian minister with a love of Zen Buddhism. And in his forward to his book, he speaks of an infinite ocean of existence, which from time to time expels myriad droplets, which are finite, separate, and unique. And they go through this cycle of growth and finally are reabsorbed into the infinite ocean and become indistinguishable. And that's the way he sees life.
We may have that. That sounds familiar. That may be in this section, but I'm not sure.
I'm sorry I don't have the author right at my fingertips.
The name again is Infinity?
Infinity in your hand. It's a line of poetry from a piece of poetry that Blake wrote.
No, we don't have it. No, I think about it.
Well, I only bring it up because it speaks to this paradox of individuality and unity. And I like what the gentleman at the rear said about we become encased in something and we acquire individuality. And at some point it falls away and we are in total indistinguishable union with the ultimate reality.
But if you practice meditation, it may take you this amount of time, it may take you several lifetimes. Eventually, you will come to the conclusion. If there is this
Okay. One of the things that I would like to comment on further, when we were talking about the principle of hierarchy, in my reading about the Theosophical Masters, I discovered that, and many of you may know this, that there are the Tibetan masters, there are Middle Eastern masters, and there are masters centered somewhere in the Yucatan. Each group has its Mahachohan. And I asked George if he knew who came next in the hierarchy, and George said, well, you tell me. And it's the Buddha. And the reason I bring this up is the Buddha was very, very careful in his lifetime of teaching 2,500 years ago to continually refocus people on the process of living now and moving out of the way of life that epitomized the second noble truth, that of suffering. Trying to bring people to recognize the source of suffering, the influence of this egotistical personal self, and the way out of that, which is the fourth noble truth, which is to follow the Eightfold Path. And if you read the Eightfold Path, it's all about how we live now, including seeking these very deep meditative experiences.
we have
So-
to wrap it up.
And that's what I want to wrap up with. Isn't it a shame that I got the last word? That's what we're engaged in now, and that's what's important.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Enjoyed the-